Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Now a segment for the Health and Climate Tuesdays section of the show, which we've been doing every week this year. We'll be on the climate side today. Governor Hochul is under fire from climate advocates the last 2 days, big time, a few days, after 2 major moves, approving the long-disputed Williams Northeast Supply Enhancement Gas Pipeline. I know that's a mouthful. It's a project that state regulators had rejected several times on environmental grounds, and agreeing to delay implementation of New York's all-electric buildings law, which begins phasing fossil fuel hookups out of new construction. Earth Justice and other groups say these decisions are political favors for fossil fuel interests that will raise bills and worsen pollution. The governor argues she's protecting reliability and affordability and giving courts time to resolve outstanding legal questions. A recent New York Times story is also raising questions about potential conflicts of interest involving clients of the law firm where the governor's husband works. And there's a new advocacy group report out today detailing a sharp increase in lobbying by utilities and fossil fuel companies under Hochul, including firms that have pushed to weaken the state's climate laws in various ways. So we are joined by Liz Moran, policy advocate in Earth Justice's Northeast office, to talk about what these decisions could mean for New Yorkers' bills, the state's climate goals, and the politics around all of this from an environmental advocate's point of view. Liz, thanks for joining us for this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. Happy to be here.
And I will ask you some pushback questions as we go from people on the other side of these issues. But how would you characterize what these 2 decisions, approving the gas pipeline and delaying the all-electric buildings law, signal about Governor Hochul's current approach to climate and energy policy?
I have to say, it's not even just these 2 recent decisions. Unfortunately, over the past year, we have seen a number of decisions the governor has made, proactive decisions that only stand to benefit the CEOs of the oil and gas industry and utilities. And it runs directly counter to what the governor proclaims is her own energy affordability agenda. These are totally decisions that backtrack former commitments she made. Take, for example, the recent backsliding on all-electric new construction. That was policy that the governor rightfully championed based on the science and evidence that it will not only help us reduce climate pollution, but it'll also save New Yorkers money. So to be where we are now is profoundly disappointing and only stands to harm New Yorkers' wallets.
Let me ask you a pushback question on the all-electric buildings law. This comes from the New York Post editorial board, and it says, the All-Electric Building Act pretends that forcing a switch to electric heat and cooking will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even though New York's electric supply relies on burning more fossil fuels than it did a decade ago. Is that a contradiction here? You need to generate the electricity in some way, and a lot of that comes from fossil fuels. So is it really any better than using the fossil fuels directly in people's homes for gas stoves?
This is a common thing that the oil and gas industry loves to raise. And the bottom line is we're talking about new construction. So we're talking about preventing new customers, new homes from being locked into an extremely expensive and dirty fossil fuel system. There are a number of studies that show that getting on all electric new construction is going to save these homeowners money. But the other thing that's beautiful about all electric new construction is it provides cooling for people in the summer, and that's far more energy efficient than AC units that many people currently rely on. So we would see less energy demand in the summer from these buildings. Now, energy demand would go up in the winter, but currently our system has excess energy during the winter time. So this would not provide a strain on the grid. And of course, we're not going to dispute. We would love to see, and we need to see, to help save New Yorkers money, more renewable energy, battery storage, and transmission come online. But the governor needs to do much more to prioritize those things.
And listeners, we can take some phone calls, comments, or questions on these climate-related measures that Governor Hochul has taken recently on the gas pipeline and on the all-electric buildings law. 212-433-WNYC. You can call with an opinion. You can call with a question. If you made the switch to electric heating or cooking, or if you rely on gas or oil, have you noticed anything in your bills recently? We know utility bills have been going up everywhere. And your comfort, for that matter, give us a call with your story or opinion or a question. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text for Liz Moran from the environmental advocacy group Earth Justice. Going back to that New York Post editorial, on the question of affordability, you say this is going to be cheaper for people. They say these ideas, this is about the All-Electric Buildings Act, never made sense except as a symbolic trophy to impress Democratic primary voters. So they think that's what this is about as Hochul runs for re-election. But then it says if the governor were serious about ensuring long-term affordability for average New Yorkers, she'd push for outright repeal of the act, not just delay, then roll back as much of the climate agenda as she can. And we hear this on the conservative side of politics a lot, that if there are mandates to move away from some energy sources, not just the ability to create more wind, and some of them, of course, are against wind and solar in the first place. But I think the more mainstream conservative argument is, yeah, build all the wind, build all the solar, add more nuclear, but don't force people to dismantle the fossil fuel infrastructure because, you know, it takes supply and demand out of whack, so it pushes energy prices up. What's your response?
There are some fantastic reports that show that people who live in all-electric new homes are going to save money. And that needs to be the top priority for Governor Hochul and New York State lawmakers. There is an energy affordability crisis in New York. And the reason that is squarely lies on our dependence on gas and gas infrastructure. Gas prices keep going up, and the costs of maintaining and replacing and expanding gas infrastructure are showing up on New Yorkers' energy bills. This is unsustainable. We need to see lawmakers do much more to protect New Yorkers from those rising costs. And transitioning New Yorkers to gas, starting with new construction, is common sense. A report that was released just a few weeks ago found that families who live in all-electric new homes stand to save at a minimum $1,000 per year on average. These homes are also cheaper to build. According to the New Buildings Institute, all-electric homes are $7,000 to $8,000 less expensive to build. So if the priority is saving New Yorkers money, we need to stop caving to the lies of the oil and gas industry, who do not care about saving everyday New Yorkers money. They care about their own profits.
And Joe in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
What you got?
I just wanted to make a comment. Specifically, the amount of energy that it takes to heat and cool a building through electricity is significant. In fact, heat is one of the most inefficient things that you can do with electricity. So while I am extremely pro renewable energy, and especially the idea behind this act, over half of the electricity that's produced for the city alone is produced from fossil fuels. So to convert that energy source from fuel to electricity and then back towards producing heat is wildly more inefficient than just piping natural gas directly into heat suppliers to the building. So very, very interesting bill, but I'm not sure I can get behind it right now with our current infrastructure.
Liz, what do you say to Joe in Brooklyn?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that New York City already has all-electric new construction in effect. So it's important to clarify the existing law in New York City and New York State doesn't address existing buildings. It's about new construction. New York City has Local Law 154, which has already been in effect for a year. So new buildings that are under 7 stories are already being successfully constructed as all-electric new builds. And there's plenty of data to indicate that these buildings are more energy efficient and save the people who live in them money. But to that end, it's really important to note that we need to tackle large energy users. There's concerns about grid capacity, and it's falsely blamed on electrification. These homes and businesses don't consume that much energy. The energy hogs we need to worry about are data centers for AI and cryptocurrency mining. Cryptocurrency mining in New York alone, actively, consumes as much energy as it would take to power over 970,000 homes. That would be the second largest city after New York City. So lawmakers do need to take energy consumption very seriously, but that should not be placed on building electrification. We need to look at the energy hogs that are causing energy bills to go up.
One listener writes as a quick response to Joe in Brooklyn, and maybe you just did that, but the listener writes, please fact check that caller. Electricity used in heat pumps is way more efficient than fossil fuel powered heat systems. I guess that's what you were just addressing. But the kind of concern that he raises is kind of consistent with what some people here say. I'm just looking at these other texts that are coming in. I'm trying to find a good representative one because there are a few like this, that the governor is approving the pipeline for natural gas and delaying the electric buildings law to help her with re-election next year, because there are still a lot of people like Joe in Brooklyn out there who think this reduces their choice and decreases their affordability. But there's also this other element that we see in the New York Times and a new report from some other advocacy groups that came out just this morning that say maybe it has something to do with the fossil fuel industry's power through lobbying, and even with a conflict of interest that might involve the governor's husband. So, for example, there's this recent New York Times story that raises questions about the appearance of a conflict of interest because the governor's husband works at Davis Polk, a firm connected to companies that stand to benefit from the pipeline approval and a separate crypto mining permit. And now this new report out this morning from the groups Lil Sis, Strong Economy for All, and NY Renews, and they document a major increase in lobbying by utilities and fossil fuel companies under Hochul, in one case nearly by 150%, along with campaign fundraising by some of these same firms. So do you see a conflict of interest here, or corporate lobbying influence, not just concerns about how the public will react in her re-election year?
Here's what I can speak to. There has been a disturbing pattern of behavior from the governor where she has walked back her own commitments that ultimately follow the science when it comes to climate change and would align with her energy affordability agenda. It began when she started the year by delaying implementation of our climate law. And it continues to her more recent decision in deciding to walk back their previous position and delay all electric new construction. You know, what's happening with the misinformation from the oil and gas industry is sadly par for the course. We're talking about an industry that is extremely well endowed and has spent billions and billions of dollars over the course of decades lying to the public. And so maybe it doesn't always come in the form of overt climate denialism these days, but it instead comes in the form of lying about how acting on climate and more renewables would actually save people money. It comes in the form of lying about the benefits of electrification. And what we need elected leaders like Governor Hochul to do is to demonstrate true leadership and show what we need to do to actually save New Yorkers money while staying true to our climate law.
You know, we are getting a fair amount of pushback on this, both on the phones and in text messages. There are definitely people who support, but our audience, at least those who are inclined to chime in, seem fairly divided on this. One text says, your guest totally sidestepped the caller question about gas to electric to heat and efficiencies pertaining to the 5% loss in electric transmission. So do you have any concern about too much demand on the grid risking power outages?
No, because all electric new construction is a really small portion of energy demand on the grid. And even our system operator notes that a bigger threat to our grid is large energy users like data centers and cryptocurrency mining. So these buildings, as another listener noted, are more efficient than fossil fuels. And they are especially more efficient in the summer when we have heat waves that are increasingly becoming a problem due to climate change. Heat pumps are actually a benefit because they consume less energy during that period of time. And they offer a lot of people AC that don't necessarily have it right now.
John in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with Liz Moran from Earth Justice on Governor Hochul's delay of the implementation of the All-Electric Buildings Act and her approval of a controversial gas pipeline. Hey, John.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it. So I just wanted to say that I have a little cottage upstate, and in the cottage, I actually have the highest rated electric heat pump at 1,800 BTU for 1,000 square feet. And when it works fine. Although I have to say, I also have electric baseboard, and the heat pump, it puts out heat, but it really can't get to every part of the house. So it has to be supplemented with the baseboard. But the real point is that when the electricity goes out, especially, we're in New York State, so storms and things like that, that's going to happen, and it's happened to me. If I didn't also have backup gas heat in the form of gas burning, stoves, then I would go days without any heat at all. So while it's good to have, it can't be the only source of heat. So that's the one point I wanted to make.
Thank you. What about that backup, Liz?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story, John. And it's great that you have heat pumps. Well, all electric new construction, our statewide law, doesn't prohibit backup generators. So I think that's really important to note. Of course, nobody wants anyone to go cold if there's a power outage in the winter. And I think there's misconceptions about the gas system versus heat pumps. The people who are relying on fossil fuel boilers for their homes also depend on electric generation. So they can go out too. So I think it's really important for people to understand that the law doesn't prohibit emergency backup generators. And ultimately, the gas system is just as vulnerable to power outages as the electric system.
And some texts that are coming in on your side. Before we run out of time, listener writes, I just don't understand the timing of the backstep from green energy. We already planned for the shift, and now we're suddenly changing course while global warming only gets worse. Another listener writes, maybe mention the climate impact of gas. We've talked more about the Electrified Buildings Act more than the approval of the gas pipeline. So listener writes, gas pipelines leak constantly in order to control pressure. So you want to say one last word about that from Earth Justice's viewpoint, and then we're out of time.
Sure. So it's a real whammy for New Yorkers to have this pipeline approved. It's going to have extremely detrimental climate impacts, and it's going to raise energy costs for New Yorkers. It's not like the company is going to be covering all those costs. It's going to cost about $3 billion, and that's going to be on the costs of ratepayers. So when it comes to climate emissions and what we need to do to reduce those emissions and help save New Yorkers money, we need a course correction from the governor here, big time. There is one bill I want to note that's before the governor that is a win-win that would save New Yorkers as much as $600 million every year while helping us reduce climate pollution. And that's a bill that would repeal an outdated fee that shows up on people's utility bills called the 100-foot rule. So these have been really disappointing decisions as of late that harm our climate, that harm the wallets of New Yorkers. And we need the governor before the year ends to sign the 100-foot rule to start a course correction.
Climate and energy issues engaged as Governor Hochul begins to run for re-election. We thank Liz Moran, policy advocate for Earth Justice's Northeast office. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show. I'm producer Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. This weekend, the G20 convenes in Johannesburg, the first time the summit has ever been held on African soil. South Africa has hoped this would be a moment of global leadership for President Cyril Ramaphosa and symbolically for the continent. But in the past few weeks, the U.S. pulled out entirely, and China's Xi Jinping said he won't attend, taking some of the shine off of what was meant to be a historic gathering. Still, as Semaphore Africa's Yinka Adegoke, reports, South Africa has used its G20 presidency to elevate a set of issues that matter deeply to African nations. That includes the continent's mounting debt burden, the question of how to pay for a just energy transition, and the reality that in many countries, more money is now flowing out to foreign creditors and then coming in as new financing. So what does the U.S. boycott actually change? And what does a successful summit look like when major powers aren't in the room? We'll get to all of that now with Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semaphore Africa. Hi, Yinka. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you for having me again.
And listeners, if you have ties to Africa or if you follow Africa, global politics, or international development, what do you make of the U.S. skipping this G20? And what issues do you think African leaders most need the world to hear right now? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Call or text. Yinka, you write that South Africa was heading into this week expecting a major moment of global leadership until the U.S. boycott and Xi Jinping's no-show. How have those decisions been received in South Africa?
Well, we do know that President Ramaphosa sort of had to do a kind of diplomatic shrug and say, well, it's their loss not to be there. That's a direct quote from him ahead of this. But let's be clear about this. There are two things going on here. The first is that, the U.S., or rather more correctly, the Trump administration is very unfriendly towards what you might call multilateral diplomacy. It's not just about the G20. You could see it with its sort of pulling out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, from January 1st.
Hmm.
The United States is not at COP, right now, going on in Brazil. It's had all kinds of comments about things to do with the United Nations and weakening that organization. So, just generally, President Trump, the Trump administration is just not a fan of multilateral organizations or just multilateral diplomacy or just this idea that, because for him, you get the sense that everything is about, doing individual deals and working with different presidents and counterparts and not this kind of working together and this kind of uh, partnerships where we all grow together and we all countries develop. It kind of is like happy talk to these guys, right? This is something that they don't care about very much. The other thing that is more specific to this situation is that he really has a bee in his bonnet about this particular South African government. Ever since Elon Musk put it in his ear that there's, killing of white African farmers, which is untrue, is been proven time and time again not to be true. He's just had a real bee in his bonnet. Back in May, he literally attacked President Ramaphosa in the White House Oval Office. So, he wants to stick to that, and basically he pulled that up again in pulling out of the G20, calling it a disgrace that South Africa has been allowed to host this event, even though, it's the first time it's been held in Africa. And, let's be clear, that can be seen in a certain way as well. Like the first time Africa hosts this and you say we're not going and no one from your administration should go. And if you think about it, even when we talk about President Xi not going from China, and we shouldn't put them on the same
Hmm.
in the same basket because China is fully represented here, and President Xi has not really been going to multilateral events himself in person, but China gets well represented, and they are very strong partners with South Africa and other African countries, as we hear
Yep.
repeatedly from the United States.
Well, Yinka, to that bee in Trump's bonnet, as you put it, I'll just note for listeners are probably familiar that Musk is of South African
Yes,
origin.
correct.
So that is probably why if listeners are scratching their heads, just to mention that. But Trump's nominee for U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Leo Brent Bozell, is a conservative media personality with no diplomatic background. Bozell has talked about a so-called, quote, white genocide. So how is that rhetoric shaping how South Africans view the U.S. boycott and the broader U.S. South African relationship right now?
I think the reality is, like in most countries, there is of course a minority of white South Africans, and undoubtedly they have South Africa has had a very recent history of a lot of violence, but it does not happen largely to white South Africans. Um, but at the same time, you can tell that even when you talk to um, uh, white South Africans themselves, they kind of acknowledge that this is they like their they love staying in their country. They have a good life here. All right, I'm in Johannesburg, and I flew in earlier this week, and I was talking to a white African farmer on my flight, and I said, where are you coming from? And he said, North Dakota. And what were you doing there? And he said, oh, I go there and work for 6 months of the year farming. I was like, okay, so are you moving to the US? He said, no, 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 no. I have no. The US is too expensive for me. I like my life in Free State or wherever he was from. The reality is, if white South Africans are being killed every day, this is not the kind of thing you would hear. You would hear about people being desperate to
To
move
move. Hmm.
to move, and this is not what you hear. So, um, people are feel defensive, feel offended, but they also acknowledge there's a kind of reality that there are challenges in South Africa itself for ordinary, everyday South Africans of all races, but particularly the majority who are the poorest, the Black South Africans. So that remains a reality that this country is trying to solve as well.
And listeners, if you're just joining us, my guest is Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semaphore Africa. We're talking about the G20 summit, which kicks off in Johannesburg, South Africa this weekend. Listeners, if you have ties to Africa or if you follow Africa, global politics, international development, any of that, what do you make of the U.S. skipping this G20? Or what other issues do you think African leaders most need the world to hear right now? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Caller text. Let's go to a caller. Rudolph in South Park, New York. Rudolph, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you so much for the show. Yinka, thank you for coming. I have a question. Can you explain to listeners why is President Bola Tinubu going to South Africa? Initially, we were told that he was going to go there to meet with the American delegation, and now they are not going there, and he's still going, knowing that they kidnapped some kids, school kids in Nigeria, in Kebbi, and they killed a general, the terrorist, and also yesterday they attacked a church and killed worshippers. Under that condition, why will a Nigerian president go to South Africa for G20? And the other question, since these Americans are not coming, the Chinese president is not coming, can you, as somebody in the media space, make a case for Africans leaders who go to Washington and go to Russia? They are summoned, they all rush to those places for meetings. What's going on? Why is this happening?
Rudolph, thank you so much for your call. Yinka, two questions there. Where do you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to speak for Nigeria in this case. I mean, I am Nigerian as well, and I obviously pay attention to Nigerian politics. I would say that if you're one of the criticisms of President Tinubu has been, a sort of lack of international engagement, if you like, a lot of sort of being very inward looking. So actually seeing him attending the G20, if this is correct, if he does show up, would be, would be interesting, would be unusual because he hasn't done that very often, and he hasn't, sort of been out to some of the usual places, some of the usual countries that a lot of African presidents tend to go. But that's not, if the idea is he was going to go there to meet Americans, that would have made sense anyway. He would just need to engage Americans, perhaps, in Washington. And what was the second question again? That was about yes, about African presidents going African leaders in general going to all these other countries when they're invited. This is clearly a bugbear for many Africa watchers who, get frustrated that, there's this whole thing called the Africa plus one kind of summit where, every country, Italy has an Africa summit and presidents go, and France has an Africa summit, and it's always plus one. It's just one country and then all these other countries that turn up. And it's, and I think increasingly, as you can see with some of the protests from Gen Z and other people on the continent, there's a lot of growing frustration that these presidents are not fixing the problems. But here's the other challenge for them, is that they need to also raise funds for their countries, right? They have these young populations, they have all the sorts of challenges around infrastructure deficits and other kinds of so many other problems. They have lots of debt, which, this is one of the big talking points at G20, and one of the things that South Africa has kind of been successful with sort of putting on the table, which is this idea that there are so many countries on the continent who spend more paying interest on their debt than they do on health or than they do on education. And when you have a young population and you're not building schools and you're not building hospitals to take care of your populace, it's a recipe for disaster in the long term, right? So they're kind of caught between these two places with these two very difficult situations where, yes, sure, it doesn't look great politically to keep on going to these usually former colonial powers or what have you. But at the same time, if you are not negotiating and trying to bring investment into your country, you are stuck in a very, very, very tough situation. Um, South Africa has done a good job in just sort of getting people to think about these issues because many countries really need their their debt to be renegotiated to lower interest on debt. The cost of capital for many countries is way too high, and more countries are working on this now. Trying to figure out ways that they pay less on their debt every quarter.
Well, let's explain what that kind of looks like a little bit. You highlight that last year, 17 African countries saw more money flowing out to foreign creditors than
Yes.
coming in as new financing. So for listeners, what does that actually look like on the ground?
What that looks like on the ground is that, as I was saying, schools don't get built. The governments become almost unable, well, quite frankly, really unable to take care of their citizenship, right? They're one of the problems you see in many sort of regions like take one like the Sahel, for instance. You have countries where half the country or two-thirds of the country is controlled by insurgents, right? In Burkina Faso as one example, or Mali, right? And why is that? It's because the governments don't have enough resources to be able to even fund to keep their citizens safe. How would they normally raise those funds? They would normally be able to have people paying taxes, have it, running businesses and all the rest of it, and none of that is happening. It's not just about, not being competent or corruption and all the rest of it. Those are all part of the mix, clearly, but uh, there are just fundamental problems which require um, countries to have less, even when they borrow, to have debt that they can actually manage. So all these things are kind of all linked together. Where there's too much interest when they borrow, they're very happy to borrow the money, but then they haven't kind of worked out how they're going to pay this back. So this is kind of the incompetence part of it.
And
So
please go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just going to wrap up and say, and that's how you get to the situation where, you know, they end up spending all this money on interest every quarter to, it could be banks in Europe or on Wall Street, what have you. Meanwhile, ordinary people, um, have no hospitals, have no schools, have no, sort of basic materials that they need for daily life.
And how central is that reality to South Africa's message at the summit? And are other G20 governments genuinely receptive to it?
Well, that's a really great question when you say whether other countries are receptive to it. I mean, and this is the kind of the point, right, about consensus. Um, the the fact that South Africa puts this on the table raises the profile of this topic, and then you're supposed to have a kind of, you know, a consensus where they agree to some of the, we will keep talking about this, we will be thinking about this, we will align on some of these topics, right? That kind of moves, it kind of moves the issue forward as against let's not like it's they're going to hand over to the United States, at the end of the year. And you can imagine that these some of these topics will be nowhere on the agenda, right? But if South Africa has at least managed to put it, up to a certain stage on the agenda, it forces countries to have to consider it. And then, it just works its way through. And that's kind of the hope. You can only put things on the table, and if they're not there at all, then what is the point of G20 for Africa?
One of the people you spoke to while reporting this story is Hannah Ryder, who leads a development-focused consultancy called Development Reimagined. She agrees that South Africa has elevated the debt issue, but argues the U.S. withdrawal still really matters, especially because Washington
Absolutely.
holds veto power at the IMF. What parts of the agenda become harder or maybe even impossible without the U.S. engaged?
Well, the finance part, because so much of the way the post World War II Bretton Woods structure was set up just means that the United States has a lot to say over, World Bank and even the IMF, even though the leadership of the IMF is often left to the Europeans, but they're all headquartered in Washington, D.C. Um, and frankly, if you want to really kind of see, I mean, just sort of breaking news in the last sort of few hours that even though the United States is not here, they're still trying to affect what South Africa can, as the leader of the G20 right now, what it can leave on the table, right? So South Africa is obviously pushing for more consensus, more unity, more alignment, but the US is saying, well, whatever you guys decide right now cannot be recognized because we're not there. So they literally have put this in writing, according to some reports. So the United States still matters, even when they're not in the room, right? They still, you can always imagine, as we've seen in so many other situations, that the Europeans in particular will tend to just go along with whatever the United States um, demands, unless it's, not in their particular interest. But if it's about the global South and Africans, then they'll probably just go along with whatever the US demands.
Yinka, as we run out of time in this segment, I want to get your take on some of the issues beyond debt, or one in particular. South Africa is pushing green financing and disaster response as a major agenda item. What's actually in those proposals? And given the continent's accelerating climate shocks, is this being seen as a potential pivot on climate finance?
Well, it's not so much a pivot as it's like something that African countries have been calling for a long time. And frankly, even before G20, South Africa has been a leader on this. Listen, you've heard this quoted many times before, how little the African continent contributes to the sort of the damage
Greenhouse
that
gas emissions?
greenhouse gases
Mm-hmm.
that man has contributed. And so little of that is coming from the African continent,
Right,
but so
compared to
much
the
of the
US.
impact, yeah, exactly, compared to the US or China. Um, but so much of the damage, so much of the impact is happening on the continent, right? And these are countries that really, many of the countries, pretty much all of them, um, will struggle to be able to protect themselves and to upgrade infrastructure. Well, all the billions of dollars you need to be able to adapt. And I the agenda that South Africa has raised on this is certainly something that is being discussed. Nothing has really changed in the kind of the way that everyone expected it to change by now. Let's be frank, that it feels like there has been a setback in the last year. Um, but of course, it's one of those topics where people remain hopeful and believe that, powerful nations and wealthier nations will come round to understanding that it's also in their interest to support um, poorer countries, whether they're in Africa or South Asia or wherever, because people will be forced to move and all the other challenges that will happen as we start to see the impacts of climate change really affect everyday people everywhere.
More remains to be seen as the G20 summit kicks off in Johannesburg this weekend. We'll leave it there for now with Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semaphore Africa. Yinka, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show here on WNYC. I'm Tiffany Hansen in for Brian today. He will be back on Monday. Right now, we're going to tie up this show with a little advice for what can be, for some people, a particularly uncomfortable conversation between adult children and their parents. What are we going to do with all of this stuff? Have your parents amassed collections of knickknacks, gadgets, antiques, heirlooms, other items that maybe you classify as junk? Maybe they bring you random little items whenever they visit, try to foist a whole bunch of stuff to you en masse during your trips home. Are they sensitively leading decluttering efforts, or is it turning into sort of a knockdown drag-out? Well, you can call. Let us know what your experience is, 212-433-9692. You can call us. You can text us at that number with us to talk about it and shed a little light on this potentially big family conflict. Is Emily Stewart, senior correspondent at Business Insider. Hi, Emily.
Good morning.
All right. So for well-off parents who pass away, leave their kids, or maybe they're just downsizing, right? Leave their kids with lots of stuff to sort through. You write that Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z are becoming really inundated with this boomer windfall of items, right? From previous, and maybe even not just their stuff, but like from previous generations. What is it about boomers that makes them have so much more stuff than the rest of us, maybe? Question mark.
I mean, to some extent, this isn't necessarily like just about baby boomers. We all accumulate a lot of things across our lifetimes. That being said, we know that baby boomers do have some characteristics, right? Like they were raised by parents who are depression babies, who were like, you have to hold on to everything because we don't have that many things, right? We also know they kind of grew up in an era of a real economic boom, and baby boomers were kind of like the more generation. They liked stuff. They liked collecting things. In the 80s, it was really a thing where like you wanted to have like the person who has the most stuff wins. So I think like we just have baby boomers really have had a lifetime to accumulate stuff, and they like stuff. And so they have wedding china, and they have silver, and they have all sorts of knickknacks. And it's not just their own stuff either. Like you said, they have their parents' stuff, but a lot of times, like for their Gen X and millennial kids, we're guilty of leaving our stuff in our parents' homes. And so now, as they age and some of them start to think about downsizing, they're looking in their garages, their basements, and they're thinking, oh boy, what do I do with this? And their kids are coming home for the holidays and they're saying, oh boy, what do you do with this? And is this my problem?
I did have a little bit of that reverse conversation you mentioned there last night. I was talking with my son about the fact that we still have a storage unit full of stuff, some of which is his. And I was, it was me that was saying, buddy, you got to get this stuff out of here. Like we're not holding on to it anymore. That is not really the more common thing we're talking about here, which is parents leaving their kids with stuff, which I will do to him, by the way. And I know that my mother will leave things to me, a lot of which I'm looking forward to. So it's not all bad, right?
Yeah, it's not all bad. I think, there are some things that people really like. I think sometimes where the issue comes in is, for example, my mother's memories are not my memories, and the things that she cares about may not be the things that I care about. And we attach a lot of emotion to our possessions, right? So if my mother wants to leave me something and I don't want it, like that's a lot of guilt for me. Maybe that hurts her feelings. And so I think for families, this is it's a really kind of fraught situation because it is everything. It's not just like a ring or a family heirloom. It's also, what do you do with your spoon collection that you've been building for years? Or what do you do with your clothes? I mean, really over the course of our lives, we accumulate so many things. And so some of it is, nice and positive, but I think some of it is pretty fraught and difficult. And it is an emotional thing to get rid of things. Like we care about our stuff. We value our things. And so it can be a little bit hard if there is something where a parent really wants their child to take and their child is like, oh man, I really don't care about this. I really don't want this. But also there's a level of guilt, right? Where it's like maybe dishes have been passed out in the family And just, you think you should take them, but also, especially now, if you're a millennial or Gen Z living in New York City, you might not even have space for them. And you bring up the storage unit. Last year I did a story on this talking to a bunch of downsizers, and they all were very against storage units. And I don't know if that's the right advice to everybody, but I think it comes, and a lot of them said, like, if you don't want whatever, this furniture from your grandparents now, are you going to want it 10 years and $20,000 later? Like, probably not.
Storage units kick the can down the road, no doubt about it. All right, we have a text here. My late artist father left me with more than 2,000 pieces of his own work, presumably our work. He has work at the Met, the Whitney, but otherwise there has been no market for it since the 50s through the 70s when he was pretty successful. I've given away about 100 pieces in recent years, but now I'm stuck knowing what to do with it. That seems like a pretty big onus to have on someone. And I think that maybe falls on more people than not, Emily, where there is something that is of value. It has historical value. It has, and not just a personal value, but a value to, art lovers or people who love, widget X, whatever it is. How do you facilitate that without coming off like just a jerk?
Yeah, I spoke with an antiques dealer last year about this, and he kind of said, part of my job is to sometimes break people's hearts, right? That people will come in, say, here's this art from my dad, or here's this tea set that grandma really held on to that she thought was going to be worth money someday. I thought it was going to be worth money someday, and it's not worth money. And what he told me at that moment was sometimes I explain to them just maybe the financial value is not there right now, but that doesn't mean it can't have an emotional value to you. And maybe think about that. Now, that being said, if you're sitting with tons of works of art that you don't know what to do with, that's a hard one. And I don't think there are easy answers. And I spoke to somebody who is a downsizer professionally, but she was talking about her wedding china. And she really, was trying to get rid of it, was trying to give it to her kids. She was trying to sell it, and eventually said, I gave up and I took it to a church yard sale. And sometimes that's just, unfortunately, the reality of the situation. But I do think it's important to remember just because maybe something doesn't have the financial value anymore doesn't mean that it's not valuable in other ways.
We are talking with Emily Stewart, who is a senior correspondent at Business Insider, about stuff, what Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z are doing as they are becoming more and more inundated with baby boomer stuff from their parents, from previous generations. Emily, let's bring our listeners into the conversation. Louisa in Sparta. Hi, Louisa.
Hi, how are you? I had to chuckle when I heard this topic.
All right, let's hear it.
I'm 75, so I have amassed an accumulation of stuff that I probably don't even know I have. Every now and then I go through a suitcase that I'm storing things that when I used to be a size 8, and I say, oh my God, and I reminisce, and I said, do I really need this? I show it to my daughter, and she kind of cringes, and I say, okay. And so what I decided to do after I started going to a lot of estate sales, I kind of just like doing that. You never know what you find. And I also like to look at the houses. But I was stunned by the volume of just stuff that were in some of these homes. These are for people that were seniors and have passed away. And they had so much stuff. And I just kept thinking about my house. I'm not overwhelmed with things, but when I look at my shelf and the mantelpiece above the fireplace, the top of my piano, everywhere I look, there's something. There's a bunch of stuff. So I have started to downsize. I take a lot of things to the thrift store at the church so that they can benefit from it. And I'm hoping that I'm going to be around a lot longer than, just a few years. But when the time comes, I am not going to have my children have to dig. I think that's got to be such a sad thing for them to experience. So I'm going to try and leave the nice stuff and minimal. I've gone so far as to create a When I'm Gone book. So it has a lot of instructions in there. So you don't have to dig through these boxes of papers that I also have.
Yeah. Louisa, I totally appreciate that point of view because, Emily, there's a logistical point of view here, right? It's not just about the sentimentality or not of the stuff. There is real logistical nightmares that can pop up for people. It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things, especially, as I've been like thinking about this and reporting on it, I would hear from the professionals on this is a lot of people think we just pull up a dump truck and we do it in a weekend. And that is not how any of this works. I mean, I don't think anybody can think, I can just move out of a house that I've lived in for 40 years in 3 days or throw everything out. And so I do think, it really is a big undertaking. Some people I talked to said, especially it sounds like a situation with like Louisa where it's like, start early and you start small, like start on the things that aren't going to be, like a really big deal to get rid of. But, like you can just kind of take it like little by little. So that way it doesn't feel like such a big undertaking. And I think that was helpful to hear. A lot of people said too, and, like I noticed this with my own mother when I go visit her, it is, do you want this? Do you want that? Do you want that? And a lot of, the answer sounds like with Louisa's daughter is like, well, no, I don't want this. But like, sometimes what you might just want to say is like, sure, I'll take it. And then you can do whatever you want with it, right? Like if you want to give it, if you want to take it to Goodwill, that's fine. Because sometimes like your parents, your grandparents, it's not so much that like they really care where it's going, but they feel too guilty and burdened about getting rid of the thing. And so it's kind of like a nice favor to be like, here, you take it and maybe you'll love it and use it and maybe you'll junk it. And I don't really want to know.
Let's bring another caller in here, Emily. Jeff in Cortland Manor. Hi, Jeff.
How are you doing, Tiffany? Great job.
Thank you. What do you have to say about all of this?
Well, a few years ago, I helped start a company up that was focused on senior move management. Mm-hmm. And what we've ended up doing a lot of are clean outs when elderly seniors are downsizing, moving in the facility, or I'm at a job right now where for 3 days we've been cleaning out a house where the older couple had passed away. And the children will come through and take a few things. And I appreciate what your previous caller said because most of the items here are multi-generational. The parents have stuff, the kids who grew up there have stuff. We haven't even started the attic yet, and it's been 3 days and 4 30-yard dumpsters. But we end up throwing away so much stuff. We try to donate it. Donation shops won't take a lot because it's older, maybe out of style. The kids don't want it because these large hutches, where they're going to put it in their apartment. Right. The crystal that the parents adored so much.
Jeff, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I do want to get Emily's reaction to this about, just dumpsters full of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that really is a hard one. I mean, if you think even nowadays, sometimes like a Goodwill won't take furniture. And as he was getting at, these furniture, certain things go in and out of style. Like I talked to somebody last year who was doing estate sales down in Texas, and she said, like I can't hold on to an orange couch because all of like the Gen Z wants it, and that was cool in the 60s. But there's a lot of stuff where like, the big brown furniture, right, that people just don't want it. And it is a hard situation, right? Because I think we keep saying, well, we'll just donate it and donate, but
speaking of donating here, Emily, we got a text that says I've donated 500 pieces of my dad's artwork to Housing Works. Wow. They love art and it sells well. It's a good cause. A good reminder that you can sometimes find a happy home for these things.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. Just because it doesn't stay in the family doesn't mean it can't go somewhere. And I think sometimes, there are certain things that you do want to stay in the family, but there are certain things that, maybe that, big old bed, your grandchild doesn't want, but like somebody will want it.
Yeah, Emily, we're going to have to leave it there. Somebody might want it, right? Senior correspondent at Business Insider, we've been talking about all of your family's stuff. Emily, thanks so much for your time, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, take care.
And listeners, note, Brian will be back on Monday. I'm Tiffany Hansen. I've been your host today, and we hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.